Welcome to the KISSBCP webinar series, where we discuss all things that relate to no building scenarios, to no people scenarios, no third-party supplier scenarios, and lastly, no systems, all combined to create Chaos the Dragon, which is battled by King Phoenix and his shield.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Don Grennan with Continuity Insights, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, 10 Steps to Tabletop Exercise Success, which will be presented by Tam Williams of Kingsbridge, BCP. Your BCP was written last year and you were ready for anything. Then COVID-19 happened and you were flat-footed. Plan didn't really meet your pandemic needs in the end. This is where tabletop exercising comes in, exposing where your plan might be falling short before you find out the hard way. During today's webinar, we'll review the 10 critical steps that will help lead you to a successful tabletop exercise to help you prepare your business and your plan before the next business interruption happens. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that you will have the opportunity to participate in today's webinar by submitting questions through the questions pane of your control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and address them at the end of today's broadcast. In addition, if you feel that your question may require a more detailed explanation than can adequately be covered here, be sure to email Tam with your question and she will respond to you directly. Today's webinar will also be recorded for later on-demand viewing, and as a registered participant, you will receive a link to this recording. I would now like to introduce today's speaker. Tam Williams is a skilled and experienced business continuity consultant working with Kingsbridge BCP. She has honed her skills over the past 2 decades in a number of different industries, including healthcare, research, information technology, manufacturing, and finance. During that time, she has facilitated business continuity workshops and delivered presentations at a number of business continuity conferences throughout North America, and she's excited to be joining us for today's presentation. Please welcome Tam Williams.
Thank you, Don. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. Thanks, as always, to Don and CI for giving us this opportunity to learn from each other. As I've mentioned in lots of previous webinars that I've presented, I used to attend sessions like this like crazy when I first started in the BCP space, as I was kind of building up a little more experience under my belt. So I'm happy to be here sharing back to the group so other people can learn from my experience. So as the title indicates, we're going to talk about tabletop exercises today. Maybe you do them, maybe you're thinking about doing them, maybe you're looking to do them a little better. The goal for today is really for you to find at least one take-home gem that you can apply to your own tabletop exercising. Now, there's lots of different kinds of exercises that you can conduct, and so today we're only going to speak to tabletop exercises as they're seem to be the most commonly used, and they, or at least we find, they provide a pretty good benefit for minimal investment compared to a live exercise or something else more full scale. There's also an infinite number of variations on the steps I'm going to walk you through today. I'm going to share what we have found what works best, but feel free to consider this as a starting point. We vary things from client to client, so you should feel free to do the same. Take what works for your organization and leave the rest. There's really more than one path to a successful tabletop exercise. Before we jump into the agenda, let me just first spend a couple of minutes introducing you to Kingsbridge BCP. We are a business continuity software and services company. We've been operating in the BCP space since 1983. Our feature product is our Shield software as a solution, helps you to develop and maintain your business continuity plan. And with that tool, we offer a suite of communication tools to help you stay in touch with your organization and a mobile app that syncs with that SaaS tool, so you always have a current copy of your plan, even if there's no internet or cell service. And while our primary focus is on software, we still provide a range of professional services, including BCP mentoring hours that we provide with a subscription to our SaaS tool. On average, our consulting team, of which I'm a member, we do tabletop exercises around once a month. And while we typically provide these services face-to-face with the current pandemic constraints, we've been having some success facilitating these exercises remotely through video conference. It's always nice to see our clients in person. I miss them, but I have to admit I'm not missing the jet lag or weekends of travel. The years of experience facilitating these exercises really puts us in a unique position to be able to gather and kind of share the process we've found has led to the most success for us and our clients. And so that's what I'm here to do today. So our agenda is really very simple. I'm going to speak first to you briefly about why exercising is important. And then I'm just going to step you through the process we follow to perform a tabletop exercise with our clients, as well as some of the recommended kind of after exercise steps we have seen our most successful clients employ. To avoid too much detail and kind of overstating the obvious, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of the more mundane administrative steps like booking a meeting room, but really focus more on the larger elements. So let's just first start with why would we want to do an exercise? So when it comes to recovering from a business interruption, planning is really only half the story. How many projects have you been a part of that were planned to the nth degree and went off successfully with minimal problems or delays? You're probably laughing right now. If your organization is lucky, you might be part of that 2.5% that PricewaterhouseCooper has cited that actually complete your projects 100% successfully. It almost never happens. And when we put together a business continuity plan, what we're essentially setting out is a portfolio of those projects that will need to be executed should some sort of business interruption occur. So while we might be able to afford for our lobby renovation project to get a little behind or go a little over budget, we really can't afford for the projects that get our business back up and running to do the same. So as a result, we go through the motions of recovery during an exercise in an effort to validate that the business continuity plan we've put in place will actually stand up to the pressure of real events. And now while validating the plan is a primary motivator, it's really more than that. The key players in that plan, they need to know how the plan works. They need to know what information is available there to support their decision making and where they find it. They also need practice in making tough decisions. Unless they're required to sit down and actually run through an exercise, participants just don't get these experiences. So with that, let me jump into the steps I mentioned at the start. And the first of those is choosing the format of the exercise. So for a basic tabletop, there are kind of two main formats we regularly use, and I call them the small group format versus the everyone in the room format. So I'll explain a little bit about the difference between the two. The everyone in the room or large group format may be the structure that most of you are familiar with. You get key players from the plan, they're all brought together in one large room, and the exercise is conducted over the course of a number of hours. The second format, that small group format, is where each team actually conducts the exercise simply as their own individual team. They run through the same scenario, but they do it in the privacy of their own meeting. And of course, there's lots of other hybrids of these approaches that you can also use. As I mentioned at the start, there's more than one way to a successful exercise. You have to think about the needs of your organization and selecting what will work best for you. Of course, there are pros and cons to each type, and part of determining the best format to use is being clear on what are your objectives? What does success look like for your tabletop? Success may be that your relatively new teams feel confident that they can navigate their relatively new plan that they have in front of them. On the other hand, success may look like your very experienced team feels confident that they have all the skills and resources they need to navigate a very complex scenario and still hit their recovery time objectives. So being really clear on what success looks like for you, what your objectives are, will really help you structure your exercise accordingly. So let's just go back to that everyone in the room concept. That format has pros and cons, of course. So the pros of allowing every team to hear and provide feedback on what all the other teams are doing, of course, is huge. It really allows you to identify where the interdependencies of your plan might be working and where they might not. And if time permits, you can even lightly explore possible solutions where those interdependencies are breaking down. This also allows each of the teams to see and hear directly from the response management team, that entity that you have in your plan that's kind of managing the overall response. This tends to make everyone kind of take the exercise a little more seriously when they see management involved. It can also feel more realistic when you have everyone engaged and working toward that common goal together. With this format, you can also get your exercise completed in one big day, usually a few hours plus time to do an after action review, etc., which we'll go over a little later. Now, there are cons to this type of exercise as well. First, I'm sure you can relate to this as if you've done these types of exercises before, simply scheduling this type of exercise can be a challenge. Finding a large swath of time in everyone's calendars to get them all in a room at the same time for a number of hours can be super difficult. It's a big resource commitment from a lot of people. Second, your exercise can get pretty crowded pretty quickly. If you have all your response team members from all your departments in the room, you get a big head count on your hand. With a lot of people, you run the risk of teams that are not very directly impacted by the scenario kind of disengaging and feel like they wasted several hours on something that wasn't really worthwhile for them. On the other hand, if you reduce the number of people, then you don't get the input from all members of response teams, and those that are excluded don't get that experience and learning that comes from participating in an exercise. Depending on the experience of the group and the maturity of the plan, you can also get sidelined with the need to do a lot of hand holding. If you've got a relatively new plan and an inexperienced group of people in the room, your exercise can get a little bogged down. It can progress kind of slowly, and you lose the attention of people along the way as everyone kind of tries to grasp the basics of business continuity. What is this thing anyway, and why are we doing this? So we find this large group, everyone in the room format really works a little better for more experienced teams and a bit of a more mature plan. So what about that small group then? Again, lots of pros and cons. First, you can typically complete the exercise with a single group in an hour or less, which makes scheduling a breeze. A few people for a short period of time is much easier to find a calendar slot for. With a small group, you can have everyone on a given response team participate, and you have the flexibility of adjusting the scenario slightly for each team to ensure that everyone feels challenged. This keeps all participants engaged as the scenario is customized for them, and they're not spending time listening to aspects of the recovery they don't really find relevant. Each participant then leaves the meeting feeling like it was a worthwhile use of their time. With this small group, you can also go back to basics as much as needed to review those basic business continuity principles, address individual questions about how to respond, and explore any challenges the team may be experiencing with their response. Additionally, it's very easy to document very specific gaps and problem areas in each team's plan as you go through the exercise. This can be a great time to perform some of those routine plan updates that need to happen. Now, of course, you can imagine the pros of that large group exercise are the cons for the small group. The small group doesn't get to see the management team in action, and the interdependencies of the teams can get overlooked, though we do recommend really good note-taking by whoever's facilitating the exercise so that those critical dependencies can be carried forward to subsequent meetings to verify that they hold up. This is also more work for the person running the exercise. While each team may only be contributing an hour of their time, for the facilitator of the exercise, you may be committing to a week of time to run through the exercise for each response team, and potentially more depending on the size of your organization. Where we often begin with an organization that has a relatively young plan or that has experienced a lot of staff turnover or structural reorganization is with that small group model. We find individuals are less intimidated when they're able to work through their first few exercises without the pressure of a large room of people. Plus, with a young plan or one that needs a little work, it gives us an opportunity to work one-on-one with these teams to fill in some of the gaps that are identified. Once the plan and the participants get to be a little more mature, the larger group model may be employed as it adds that additional challenge of the live interdependencies between the teams. But of course, it depends on the objectives. If annual exercising is the only time of year when you have dedicated time to go through plan updates, the small group format may be the way to go long term. And we have a large number of clients who stick with this due to its kind of deep dive potential and minimal impact on each participant's time. We've also been using a third option of a hybrid of the two by combining a subset of teams, particularly those that have considerable dependencies, and conducting a few exercises with those kind of medium-sized groups. This works well if there's some question about how well the recovery strategies of a subset of teams are going to kind of mesh together during certain situations. Whatever format you choose, you'll want to evaluate your objectives for the exercise. What does success look like? The maturity and readiness of your plan and participants, the lead time you have available to find holes in calendars, and whether you can actually even gather in a room due to physical distancing requirements. With these factors in mind, you can then determine the best format for your organization and then get those invites out as soon as possible. Next, you want to be sure your plan is up to date. You'll still find things that need to change during the exercise, for sure. But whether you keep your plan digitally or on paper, there are a couple things you want to double check when it comes to updating your plan in advance of an exercise. First, make sure the plan was somewhat recently reviewed so that the information it contains is somewhat close to current reality. If you're maintaining a hard copy plan, that also means making sure the revised plan is distributed and the old copies are retrieved. And two, and I would say most importantly, make sure the team membership is correct and double check this regularly right up to the weeks leading up to the exercise. I've seen clients super proactive, they book an exercise several months in advance, and then they find out the day before the exercise is to begin that, oh yeah, the team membership has actually changed quite significantly, and now new critical team members haven't received an invite, and individuals that have moved on are still scheduled to attend. So really keep an eye on your team membership and make adjustments to those calendar invites as soon as you note that something has changed. Next, you'll want to choose an appropriate scenario. If you've completed a threat risk assessment, then it's often a good place to look for a scenario to exercise. However, the exact scenario isn't really as important as the targeted result of that scenario. When it comes to ensuring your BCP is ready for anything, you want to cover off one or more of the 4 major results or outcomes from any business interruption. No building, no people, no systems, no third-party providers. While you want a realistic scenario, you also want to make sure you're not constantly exercising the same outcomes over and over again. Your recovery teams may become very experienced with relocating employees when every scenario, whether it's a flood or a fire or a bomb threat, results in damage or evacuation of their building. But then what happens when their third-party service providers aren't operating or their data center goes dark? It's important that you regularly touch on all 4 of these possible outcomes throughout your exercises. I've included a link on this slide to our BCP Academy. We have a number of free resources there, and one of those resources is a white paper on this kind of outcome-based approach to planning and exercising. Dawn mentioned at the beginning that a copy of the presentation, a link to the live video will be made available to you following the webinar. So you can feel free to visit this Academy and download that white paper or access any other resources you might find helpful to you. Now, not all scenarios are going to impact your department equally. Mobile sales teams, for example, are very good at dealing with no building and no systems situations, as they're accustomed to losing connectivity from time to time, and they're always on the road and never in the building anyway. So you can add injects to put pressure on these teams, such as maybe wiping out part of their workforce, or you can just accept that some exercises are just not going to be as challenging for some teams. The most important thing is to make sure the exercise is neither too hard overall or too easy. Don't go for the massive earthquake with near apocalyptic consequences for a relatively inexperienced group and a relatively new plan. They'll get really discouraged and likely just throw up their hands in defeat rather than work away on the challenges in front of them. Target one outcome at a time until you're pretty confident your plan is free of major gaps, and then you can start kind of layering on the challenges. We're going to take out your building and then your systems go down, that sort of thing. Next step is seeking expertise. So once you've selected your scenario, it's really important to determine whether it's truly realistic. This means consulting with experts to figure out whether what you've dreamed up is really going to hold up. You don't want a scenario that ends up with a 5-minute solution because of a quick workaround you weren't aware of. We had this happen a couple of years ago when planning a scenario with a client. They wanted to have their teams cope with a system outage, and so they planned a scenario where construction cut the data line going into the data center. Sounded great on the surface. They expected this would take a few days to repair given their kind of remote location, and they were confident there was no easy workarounds that IT could put in place. We encouraged them to validate that assumption with their IT department that this would indeed be the case and there wasn't a simple solution that could expedite the recovery. But they were confident in their understanding of the infrastructure and the DR plan in place. So of course, we arrive, we start our scenario, and 2 slides in, IT was able to fail over their servers to their backup location and had all but one department up and running within about 2 hours. So need to do some check-in with your experts. And that expertise you need may be internal from groups like IT or maybe facilities with respect to how long the generator is going to run for, or management to see what policies, or it may be from an external authority to tell you things like how long a building might be shut down for an arson or an active shooter investigation. What is the coverage of various power grids to determine what locations or homes might be impacted by a regional outage? The more you do your research and consult with the right experts, the more realistic your scenario will be and the more buy-in you'll get from your participants. Next, something I find often gets overlooked is selecting appropriate facilitation techniques. A big part of what makes an exercise a success is really how well it's facilitated. If you're internal to a big company and doing the facilitation course yourself, you might want to consider taking a basic facilitation course as part of your professional development. I took one years ago, like probably 15 years ago now, and I still have the binder they gave me, and I still go back to the tools and techniques that taught me. So while we can't go into all the details of facilitation in this webinar, I do want to just share a few tips that I suggest. So first, make sure everyone in the room knows each other. With a large group exercise format in particular, this is key. You may want to use an icebreaker of some sort if there are a lot of new faces in the room or a management team that some may find intimidating. You want everyone relaxed and comfortable being open with one another, as a tabletop exercise can have some challenging moments. The last thing you want is someone with a critical piece of information that is too shy to speak up. These people have to work together, or they could have to work together under high stakes pressure situations in the future. So they need to start getting comfortable with it now. Decide on the format you will use to document the exercise and any injects you'll be adding. We've used PowerPoint presentations quite successfully with each slide presenting a new inject. Alternatively, handouts can be shared with the room or circulated electronically. Regardless of the approach, it's really important that the scenario be documented so that everyone is on the same page. Part of that is laying out an agenda with break time so that everyone knows when they can freely leave the room and when they're expected back. Before the exercise begins, you also want to establish some ground rules. How will everyone participate? Do they raise their hand? Do they just call out their responses? If it's electronic, do they just speak? Do they use the little electronic raise hand? How are they to handle phone calls that come in that are not exercise related? One of the rules that I highly recommend is the no what ifing rule. That's ifing. While you'll have done your research to put together a really great scenario, there will still be someone in the room that wants to poke holes or take it to a more extreme level or dismiss it altogether. This can be highly distracting for everyone and takes away from the focus on resolving the issues raised by the exercise as you have it documented. So tell them up front, the scenario was designed in the manner it is set out to target certain aspects of the plan. And while there are an infinite number of possibilities as to what could really happen, today we're going to stick with what's on the slides or in the handouts. Now, during the exercise, don't be afraid of dead air. Don't feel like you need to prompt an answer from the group, like, would you do this or would you do this? You want to see what they're going to come up with themselves from their plan, or perhaps they'll have a new creative solution that should be part of the plan. Giving them a prompt, kind of a close-ended yes, no, this or that option gives them an easy out by simply selecting from what you've provided. Try and keep your questions open-ended to encourage them to consult their plan or perhaps come up with something better that the group may want to evaluate. Give them time, give them that dead air to really pull their thoughts together and then come back to you with an answer that they've come up with themselves. Also, don't be afraid of asking what might appear to be dumb questions. This is easier to do when you're facilitating an exercise with a group you don't work with closely. It's one advantage we have as consultants. A lot of assumptions can be made in an organization, and sometimes those assumptions can be quite destructive to the success of the recovery. Assuming that person A or department A has the access to do a certain task can be a key part of the recovery. But if no one outwardly ever asks if that access exists or if they've ever done that said task, sometimes these assumptions can live on for a long time, even when they may not be correct. We have a client, for example, they have two different buildings next door to one another that they operate out of. But because of the layout of the power grid in the area, the buildings are actually powered by two different power grids, or so we had been told. For a number of years, even during the design of the power outage tabletop exercise, everyone involved assumed that the server rooms in each of the buildings were on two different grids. It wasn't until midway through the actual tabletop exercise, when they decided the second server room was going to be leveraged, that someone piped up to say that, no, the division of the power grids between the buildings was not that clean. One building and a portion of the second building, including the server room, was on one grid, and the rest of the second building was on the other grid. Both server rooms were on the same grid, same transformer. Because they had generator backup, they never really had a lengthy outage before, no one realized that the grid supplies were different. In a small group format, make note of any of these assumptions or key dependencies that are mentioned by one group so that you can validate them when you meet with the next team. Team A said you were able to do X, Y, and Z. Is this true? Another key tool that we find helpful, particularly when facilitating a large group exercise, is the use of a parking lot. This is simply a spot to jot down significant issues that need to be worked out, but would otherwise derail the rest of the exercise if they were to be discussed during the session. These are often contentious issues where there might be strong opinions in the room as to what the correct solution is. At some point, for the sake of moving forward with the rest of the exercise, the facilitator needs to suggest the issue be placed in the parking lot for further discussion at a later date. The parking lot, however, is only effective if the concept is introduced up front at the start of the day as part of the ground rules, and the items that get added to the parking lot have to be reviewed again at the end of the session, and actual decisions have to be made as to when and how those further discussions will take place to get that item resolved. It's the only way that your participants will trust in the parking lot in the future. There's lots of great facilitation techniques you can use, but one more I'll share with you is how to deal with the person who is dominating the exercise. They may have great intentions, but they just tend to talk a lot, or perhaps they intimidate the quieter folks around them, or they may be a bit of a troublemaker, taking the exercise off course, raising corner cases, going beyond the scope of what the exercise is intended to cover. Regardless of their intentions, and we'll assume they're always good, there are a couple of techniques you can use to temper the dominant talker. In an in-person exercise, if you know that an individual has a tendency to kind of take over before they walk in the room, you can use a formal seating plan and have that troublesome participant just sit very slightly behind the facilitator. So it may not make sense until I talk about the layout of the room. So imagine your room is shaped in a horseshoe, and you have everyone sitting around the horseshoe, and your facilitator is sitting at the open end of the horseshoe. It's a great shape for a discussion, by the way. You want to put your troublemakers at the tips of the horseshoe. So they're just a little behind the facilitator from where the facilitator is standing. This way it makes it more difficult for them to catch the eye of the facilitator and jump in too often. Now, if partway through the exercise you recognize that you have a dominating personality in the room that you didn't anticipate, you can also implement the option of an inject, where one or more participants are just suddenly eliminated from the scenario due to personal or medical reasons. This can be a surprise inject that isn't documented in the PowerPoint or the handout. Those are allowed. So this individual has to stay in the room to hear what everyone else is going to do in their absence, but they're not allowed to contribute until the end, when they can then address anything they might have done differently. Now, similarly, you can do the opposite if you have a quieter participant. In that face-to-face horseshoe shape I was talking about, you want your quieter participants sitting right in the curb of that horseshoe, so they're looking at the facilitator head on. They can easily then make eye contact, and that facilitator can call upon that quieter participant when it looks like they might have something they want to contribute. All right, let's move on to step number 6, which is capture. Just need a bit of water here. The other thing you'll want to have in place is a number of capture mechanisms. There are a few things you'll want to capture in various capture methods you may want to use, many of which, again, you can pick up in a good facilitation course. So let's start with the what you want to capture, and then we'll move on to the how. So in terms of the what, you want to know who is in attendance. You want the actions from everyone participating and the response to those actions by other groups. You want to capture the strategic issues that come up when a documented response strategy is not looking like such a great option anymore, and any alternatives to that strategy that might be suggested. Action items, of course, are important to capture, like missing or outdated information that needs to be collected and added to the plan once the exercise is complete, as well as those larger parking lot issues. Now, in a small group format, it's pretty easy to capture all this information with just some solid note-taking. There's not a whole lot of voices, the management presence isn't there to intimidate, so it's pretty easy to hear from everyone involved and have the time to actually get it all jotted down in short notes. In a larger group format, however, you'll hear from those voices who are comfortable speaking up or maybe representing a group within the room, but it can be more difficult to capture all of the ideas that don't get verbally shared. sometimes just because of lack of time. And when the conversation starts to move quickly from one person to another, it can be a challenge to capture both the important points and which department is making them. So that leads us to how best to capture. Among other strategies, 3 techniques we employ to ensure this capture step goes smoothly. First, we always have both a dedicated facilitator and a dedicated scribe. A person running the meeting will have enough to do to simply run the meeting, ask those awkward, dumb questions, and keep the exercise moving along. They won't have time or attention to take any notes, so it's very important to have a dedicated scribe for the exercise that can document the response, issues, actions, items, etc. This goes for large as well as small group exercises. The facilitator really needs to focus on the task at hand, the participants, the clock, etc. For a small group exercise, this is likely all you need. But once you get into a large group, you need other means of hearing from everyone in the room. And so this is where the other 2 strategies come in. One is to ensure that each table has lots of paper and pens. You can even have the paper laid out so that there are different pages for different injects or phases of the exercise. With each advancement of the scenario, provide everyone time to discuss amongst themselves and encourage them to jot down their thoughts in writing as to what their response would be. While reporting back to the larger group may be done by a representative of a response team, those notes on the table can be great fodder for additional steps, ideas, concerns, or issues that came up, but no one actually shared verbally to the room. You can also use another facilitation technique like a post-it note exercise where everyone records their ideas in response to whatever issue is at hand on individual post-it notes. These have no identifier on them to indicate who brought forward the idea. These post-it notes are then collected, summarized, and shared back to the room by the facilitator. What this allows is those who might be shy to raise their hand or even discuss a concern they have can share their concerns anonymously. Now, I find this particularly helpful toward the end of an exercise when you're asking for individuals to report on how well the exercise went, what the biggest hurdles were that they thought the organization was facing, or and we'll speak to that in the after action review, or how well the session was facilitated, ideas they have for next year, etc., all that kind of stuff. Lastly, with the pandemic upon us, I mentioned we've been doing our tabletop exercises remotely via video conferencing, which presents another option for capture, which is now recording the sessions. With the permission of those involved, recording the session provides you with a great backup should there be any lack of clarity in the notes that the scribe has taken. Sometimes the audio can be a little bit shaky on the video conferencing, and sometimes you still get people talking at the same time. It's hard to figure out who said what when. So we have gone back to those recordings just to clarify things. Next, let's get into the after action review. What do we do after the exercise is complete? With the larger group format, I like to do this right at the end of the session while everything is fresh in everyone's minds. And there are kind of 2 aspects to the after action review needs to recover, or that the after action review needs to recover. First, we want to talk about how well the plan and the team held up. This is where I find that sticky note exercise I mentioned comes in handy. One part of our after action review in a large group is to ask everyone to write down on those individual sticky notes any comments they have, the good, the bad, and the ugly, around how well the organization was prepared for the scenario. And we provide them some broad themes to consider. So these might include how well communications were done, how well IT was prepared with their disaster recovery, what about facilities and logistics, those sorts of things. This allows everyone, after having witnessed the entire exercise, to weigh in on the preparedness of the organization, whether they actively participated in the discussions that took place or not. There are lots of ways of pulling out the big take-home messages following an exercise and for evaluating the overall readiness of the organization and participants. Far too many to cover in today's webinar. It's a whole webinar on its own. The important thing is that you actually take the time to do that. During this time, you'll also want to review any action items that came up and ensure that the individuals responsible are recorded for follow-up, and don't forget the parking lot. These larger sticky items may require collaboration across a number of departments, but someone needs to be made responsible for ensuring whatever meetings or research are required actually happen. Now, the second part of the after action review is how well the exercise itself was conducted. Did everyone find it was a good use of their time? Was the time allocated too long or too short? How was the room layout? How was the Zoom connection? How was the exercise facilitated? How was the difficulty of the scenario? This is also a great time to get good ideas for the next scenario based on areas of vulnerability that may have been uncovered during the exercise itself. If participants are irritated by aspects of the way the exercise is conducted, they certainly won't be eager to participate in future events. So it's important to take that feedback and incorporate it into the planning for the next exercise. Now, if you're going with the small group model where you're meeting with recovery teams individually, we tend to do the after action review with the management team once we've met with each small group. So we review all the captured information and we pull out the broad issues and themes that management may need to weigh in on. As they won't necessarily be present in each of those smaller group exercises, it's really important that that information for each session be collated in a manner that management can then digest and identify the issues that are theirs to address. Your after action review is a great time to ensure you've captured all those action items, but it's equally important that you also review all of the notes from the exercise and incorporate those learnings into your plan. A formal plan update and review process after your exercise is key to ensuring that your exercising efforts were not wasted. Small action items can also be typically addressed during this post-exercise period, like updating contact information or adding small pieces of reference information that were found lacking during the exercise. The faster you move on these items, the better, while everything is fresh in the participants' minds. You know, as soon as they walk out of the room, they're gonna delete everything from the session. They have 1,000 other priorities. If you wait too long, they'll be head scratching, trying to remember the context and why it was they needed to do that assigned task. This is also the time to develop an action plan based on the larger issues that were identified. Issues and owners of those issues were hopefully identified and assigned during the exercise itself, but this is the time to look at those issues in the context of other corporate priorities, and working with those owners, assign timelines for getting them completed. This is one of the most critical steps following an exercise. We've had many an issue come back year after year unaddressed because no follow-up was done after the exercise to ensure action has been taken. Those clients with the most robust plans are those that take this time after an exercise to really address gaps and move actions forward, scheduling regular follow-ups to ensure that those that own the task are getting the work done. If you thought preparing for an exercise was work, this piece is actually where the real work happens. Now, lastly, sharing your success. Many people find that once their after action review is complete, action items are assigned and in progress, and plan updates are complete, other than planning the next exercise, their work is done. But actually, it's not the case. The results of your exercise now need to be shared, and this sharing comes in two forms. First, you have kind of that required sharing. Your executive team will likely want a summary of how things went. If you have a board, they'll likely want to see the results of the exercise and hear about the actions that are taking place to address any gaps the exercise uncovered. Additionally, you may have auditors or key customers that require evidence that your exercise took place. and a report summarizing any findings, etc., from that exercise. Now, these are the audiences commonly identified as needing to hear about your exercising efforts. However, there is an equally important audience that is often overlooked, and that is the employees within your organization. Not everyone is going to participate in the exercise, and they're not even going to know it took place. One of the big challenges with business continuity is raising the profile of the plan and the program. Some auditors have told us they should be able to walk into an organization and ask any employee about a company's business continuity plan, and that employee should know that the plan exists and what their role is in that plan. After your exercise is complete, look for opportunities to share the results internally. Some people will actually find the scenarios quite interesting, and some will feel reassured that their employer's taking steps to ensure the business is going to keep going if something unexpected happens. You may even find a few allies within the organization that might be interested in working on the business continuity plan or program. There are a number of ways you can share your exercise experience or results with the employees in your organization. First, you can try to get some time during an all-hands staff meeting. A few minutes to describe the exercise and results is all it takes. If you have an internal newsletter or intranet where internal happenings are shared, get something posted there to share the news with the rest of the organization. You might also be able to get some airtime at departmental meetings. All of these things will help to raise the profile of your program in the eyes of the employees as well as management, which will help with your company's recovery should the plan need to be activated. Now, the last step I'm going to speak to is making business continuity and tabletop exercising routine. Now, this doesn't mean having large-scale exercises on a monthly basis, though you should be aiming to do a formal tabletop at least once a year. There are other ways of injecting business continuity into the everyday without the formality of a large-scale tabletop exercise. One way is to leverage evacuation drills. With every drill, choose a team and ask them a few questions on the fly while they're standing at their assembly locations, such as, what would you do if you were told you weren't allowed to go back into the office today and that access would be restricted for the next week, 2 weeks, month, whatever timeline you choose? If you were told we were activating the business continuity plan right now, what would you do? Where do you access your plan from, and can you reach it right now from the parking lot? How would you communicate with the rest of your team right now? These little mini exercises can be great reminders, and being outside of the building can inject some reality into the situation that a tabletop exercise can lack when you're kind of sitting in the boardroom or the comfort of a meeting room with all the office conveniences around you. Occasional laptop drills are another mini exercise you can conduct. Many employees are issued laptops with the expectation that they will take them home at the end of the day. If this is something that applies to your organization, then this is something you may want to try. So the idea is that if something should happen after hours, they're going to have all the hardware they need to at least work remotely. But unfortunately, it's great in theory, but it doesn't always work in practice. We end up with a lot of laptops getting left at the office at the end of the day. So to encourage compliance at the end of the workday, you tour the office looking for laptops that were left behind. When you find one, you can do one of a few things, depending on how tough you want to be. You can leave a note on the laptop just reminding them that, hey, your laptop's supposed to go home at the end of the day. Or you can take the laptop altogether and leave a note or a business card as to where they can collect it. Or you can kind of spin it positively so that the department with the least laptops left behind overnight gets a prize of some sort. These mini exercises are a great way to keep everyone in the business continuity frame of mind and encourage them to recognize that business continuity is more than just plan updates and a tabletop exercise once a year. It's really a routine part of an organization's daily activities. So, as a review, here are the 10 steps again to tabletop exercising success. Choose the correct format for your exercise. Are you going to have everyone in a big room? Are you going to have small individual team meetings? Or are you going to do some hybrid of that? Make sure your plan is current. Select a scenario that is appropriate to the threats of your business, the ability level of your participants, and the maturity of your plan. And ensure you're cycling through one or more of the major outcomes: no building, no people, no systems, no third-party suppliers. Seek expertise either within your organization or outside to ensure your scenario is credible and challenging enough. We want to be sure there isn't a super simple solution that hasn't occurred to you that someone will raise right at the start, making your challenging exercise a walk in the park like we had. Select appropriate facilitation techniques, or you can hire a good facilitator. You can have the best scenario and all the right people in the room, but if the exercise isn't run well, you won't really have a very successful day. Capture as much as you can through a designated scribe and through encouraging participants to put their thoughts in writing and leaving those written thoughts behind that you can then collect and review. Consider a post-it note exercise to hear from the quieter participants in the room, or perhaps you can record the session, particularly if you're conducting your exercise remotely. Do a thorough after-action review so that you can evaluate the success of the exercise and how it was facilitated and structured. Review the parking lot and ensure that all issues, gaps, and action items have been captured along with assignments or owners for each of those. Make sure you update your plan by adding new information that was uncovered during the exercise or updating or removing stuff that's no longer current. Then follow up on those actions and issues and get timelines established for their completion. Make sure you share the success with your board, your auditors, your key clients, and within your organization and with your fellow employees to help raise the profile of BCP. And lastly, make tabletop exercising and BCP part of the everyday culture by conducting mini exercises whenever opportunities present themselves. And that brings us to the end, and I will hand it back over to Don for any questions that may have come in.
Thank you, Tim. Great presentation, and just a phenomenal amount of information there. And I think people will definitely come away with a few tips they can use when they try to conduct their next tabletop exercise. But anyway, we have a lot of questions that came in, so let's try to get to as many as we can right now. First question is, it's on everybody's mind and mine as well. And the question is it reasonable during COVID-19 to actually run a tabletop exercise?
Yeah, we've had this conversation with a lot of our clients. It really depends on the experience of the team and your current stability. So I think we have to be really mindful at this time of the mental health of our employees. Some of the changes as a result of this pandemic have been really good for some and really challenging for others. And that's not just the employees, but the organizations, the businesses as a whole. Our clients have kind of fallen into three main groups. A very small number have experienced significant furloughs and layoffs as a result. And so obviously they're putting exercising on the back burner. It's just, they're barely operating. There's really nothing to exercise at this point. The majority, however, luckily have returned to a new normal. And of these, we kind of have two subgroups. Some are struggling with what this new normal is, and so they've focused their exercising more on a lessons learned approach so that they can continuously improve on their current state and then consider how they would cope should their current situation become worse. So for a lot of organizations, this pandemic has been a loss of their building. Everybody's working from home, but they haven't experienced necessarily a huge loss of workforce. So we've been talking about how well that transition to work from home has gone, and then what would they do if the pandemic, and we hope it doesn't happen this way, but was to, take out a portion of their workforce. Could they continue to function? Now, others are coping quite well. And so they're now turning to exercising to prepare for additional challenges they foresee, such as hurricanes, wildfires. So I really think it's reasonable to continue exercising at this time, probably using a virtual method, but I really think you need to evaluate whether this is something your organization can really benefit from as well. You may also want to check if you have to report to any regulatory bodies that require exercising. Just check with them to see if there's been any leniency granted under the current conditions regarding the requirement for annual exercising.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question. I find scheduling is difficult, and sometimes I end up losing key people last minute on the day of the exercise. What do you think is the best way to handle this situation?
Well, as tough as this situation sounds, this can actually be a blessing. You're always going to have some people that don't make it, whether planned or last minute. Um, and if something terrible happens, you're never or hardly ever going to have your full workforce available to respond either. So, what we do, and this happens to us as well, we treat this as an opportunity to add a little bit of a no people situation to the scenario to see how everyone manages without that person there, particularly if they might be a more senior person. There's nothing to say that they would actually be there when the actual event happens. So we just continue, we incorporate their absence into the scenario. We say they're not there, they're not available for communication either. And the teams are going to have to just continue trucking along and figuring out what they're going to do without that person there. Particularly if they're a more senior person, just ensure they get a copy of any after action reports you put together, because they're going to want to see how everyone managed in their absence.
Okay. Here's a question that actually a number of people asked, and I'll try to summarize it all into one. But essentially, we're considering running a tabletop exercise by video conference since most of our employees are still working from home. Do you have any tips specifically for virtual exercise?
Sure. So I've alluded to that a little bit. Running a virtual exercise isn't super different from the in-person, with a few considerations. We're all experiencing a little bit of I'll call it Zoom fatigue right now in both our personal and professional lives. We found during the pandemic that with the challenges of keeping everyone engaged during a video conference, the small group short format has been working really well for us. So we're not trying to do that large, everyone in the room type of exercise by video conference. If you've always done that everyone in the room approach, this is actually a great time to try the small group approach and get a tabletop exercise completed even when you all may be physically distanced in multiple locations. So you can either have one session per team, or if you're really more concerned about some interdependencies between certain teams that work closely together, you might want to use a bit of a hybrid approach and run a number of sessions that include maybe a couple of team members from 3 or 4 teams that tend to work closely or have a lot of dependencies on one another in one single session. You also want to be aware right now that we are operating in a bit of a business continuity situation already, with a number of people displaced from their normal workplaces and processes not necessarily running as they normally do. So if you're thinking about your scenario for your virtual session and what result to target, depend whether it's no people, no building, no system, you may already be dealing with one of those. A lot of people are already dealing with a no building situation. So depending on how experienced your teams are, just be careful not to layer on too many more complexities. Now, one big advantage of this remote approach, like I mentioned, is the ability to record. So if you don't have the luxury of a scribe in addition to your facilitator, recording the session will help you capture all that information that's shared. In addition, the chat function in most video conferencing tools allows multiple participants to contribute their ideas, even if they're having trouble getting mic time. They can even direct their comments just to the facilitator. So if they're not comfortable sharing them with the larger group, you might want to point out that option that they can privately send a message to the facilitator if they have a concern about something that's being raised in the video conference session and they don't want to voice that concern themselves. So those are the main considerations we've been addressing through our remote exercising approach so far, is really keeping those groups small and then leveraging the technology whenever you can to get those quieter folks participating, whether it's just chiming in by chat. And just really being aware, it speaks to that first question about should we even be exercising right now. Just be aware of the pressure that these folks are already under. We're already in a business continuity situation, so don't layer on too thick.
Okay, great. Let's try and squeeze in one last quick question here, Tam. And the question is, should I provide participants information in advance about the specific scenario that will be used during the exercise?
There's a couple schools of thought on this here, but I'm of the camp that we don't tell them. And my main reason for this is that it forces them to think on their feet, which is really a more realistic experience. Management hates this. They don't like going in not knowing what they're going in for because they don't want to look bad in front of people. But we don't know in advance what's going to interrupt our business. So why should we know for the exercise? So my position is, whenever possible, unless you're under extreme pressure from your management team, try and keep the scenario under wraps so that everyone is hearing about it from the first time when they get in the room or on the conference call.
Okay. All right, great. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I want to assure everybody that if we didn't get to your question today, or if you have additional questions, you can reach out to Tam at the email address that's currently shown on the screen. Anybody's question we didn't get to, she will respond to you directly, so you will hear from her. And also, I want to let people know that we will be posting the recording of this webinar on the Continuity Insights website in a few days if you missed any part of today's broadcast. And a question that I got a number of times is, yes, we will provide a copy of Tam's slides, and I will be sending that out to everyone along with that link to the on-demand version of the webinar. So thank you, Tam, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar, 10 Steps to Tabletop Exercise Success. On behalf of Continuity Insights and our corporate sponsor, KISSBCP, thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.